Hello, I'm here to present a pictorial on a gendered perspective on making from an autoethnography and Makerspaces. It's by myself, Sonali Hedditch, and Dhaval Vyas, both from the University of Queensland. This paper, I believe, makes three contributions to HCI and design. The first is that it demonstrates the use of autoethnography as a method for engaging in questions and the challenges of intersectionality and identity and power relations in design research. Secondly, it provides an autoethnographic account of makerspaces and maker culture in Australia from a feminist standpoint. And third, it unpacks early insights on how to improve diversity and inclusion in makerspaces. So autoethnography is a tool that's increasingly used in HCI to inform assessment of user experience from the first person's perspective. And my position as a researcher is a woman and a woman of colour. And given my lived experience as a woman of colour entering makerspaces for the first time, I tried to explore the nuances that may otherwise go unnoticed by a researcher, if not for my personal experiences in that time. And I captured my data through photos and videos and journal entries and voice memos edited for Makerspaces over the period of 6 months, and tried to find how they encoded the use of those spaces by only certain publics rather than diverse publics. The first space was a women's only space, but it only attracted women that were elderly and white, and it was craft oriented in terms of activities. The second space focused on disassembling e-waste, and it was dominated by men, though it was keen to attract more women into the space, but struggling. The third space was a public library space, again open to the public, but attracting mostly high school boys. And the fourth space was a very large makerspace with essentially every makerspace activity you could imagine on offer, but again, very male dominated in the space. In terms of my findings, I sorted my data into 4 themes using grounded theory. The first theme looking at how I felt displaced in these spaces. In fact, if it wasn't for the fortification of being a researcher from university, I don't know if I would have comfortably entered these spaces to begin with. They certainly didn't, in terms of my internalized beliefs, feel like a place that I belonged. But again, using my experience as an exemplar for other intersectional women, I wonder how they would be able to relate to, for example, the artifacts pictured here from MD, where a certain restrictive subculture is presented to which I personally struggle to relate. There are also physical challenges in terms of the MD having its toilets available only at night, in the dark, out the back, behind a shed with very little lighting to get there. In a male-dominated space, I didn't feel safe going there. It had an operational policy that did note that it was a space that encouraged diversity and inclusion, but that wasn't actually being achieved in practice. The second theme that I looked at was the learning environment and how that really mattered to my experience. I really enjoyed the structured training and workshops on offer. I also gained a lot out of the peer learning environment, but struggled with the space MD that offered purely online instructions or guidance through peers on how to use equipment, how to engage with tools, how to go about making certain things. I struggled with Discord and I struggled with their forums, and again felt it like it was a very exclusive environment. You had to have a technical lexicon that I didn't have to engage in that online space. Whereas MA's card making workshop, for example, was just really tailored to the absolute beginner and very welcoming in its environment. MC, although I have the university education to be able to engage with its classes, I question in terms of the technical language used, the pace at which it was taught, the digital literacy required, whether women who've missed out on an education from an intersectional background, how they would go in such a space. I don't think they could necessarily engage. And MB's male-dominated, dusty, dirty peer learning environment was a lot of fun, but again, I questioned whether some women would choose to continue to come to such an environment, makerspace. I noticed a lot of gendered terminology and tools and materials in all of the makerspaces as well. On the right, I've got a picture of a Wink of Stella brush, which is a beautiful name, and I thought it was perhaps mascara that had found its way into the crafting toolbox, but learnt that it was actually some glitter glue that's used in crafting. And I was told there's a lot of parallels between makeup tools and crafting tools. When I toured around MD, they pointed out the area for sewing and for crafting and said that's the soft skills area, whereas I guess everything else was a hard skills area. Brute force was a term that was used to when they were talking about pulling away apart the projector. I couldn't physically do it, and they're like, you need some brute force and other kind of gendered language. In the fourth theme, I look at gendered roles in making, where the women at MA, they shared stories about craft being a critical skill in terms of their productivity when they were younger and the necessity of making. I had to find ways to talk to the men in the other makerspaces, and in MB in particular, the men really wanted to keep bringing conversation to talk back about my husband and his work and what he does. The men would talk a lot about their work as truckies and tradies and working on mine sites and comparing and kind of competing. And in MA, the women they really shared stories of the trauma and the domestic violence and the sexual violence that they experienced in their lifetime, and the discrimination and sexism. The conversations were remarkably different in each environment. In gender roles as well, I looked at the parallels between kind of a traditional female skill where diamond dot art or even knitting and things, which is very precise hand-based work. Diamond dot art in particular is quite similar in terms of the precision used with a soldering iron for soldering. And with 3D printers, threading that filament is similar to threading a sewing machine. So surely with these parallels, there should be ways to segue women from kind of their bucket of traditional skills into the broader skill sets on offer in makerspaces. In the discussion section of the paper, I examine those four themes confronting the internalized biases that I found myself experiencing in terms of making and maker culture, where value was lying in my mind in terms of STEM's makerspaces and commercial pursuits versus the gendered craft making for pleasure and well-being. So I look at that kind of those issues and the political issues behind that as well, with the personal being political, as well as examining those externalized aspects of making. I'd like to conclude by quickly touching on the 5 recommendations that I make in the paper to improve the diversity and inclusion of makerspaces. Firstly, that the makerspace needs to be physically set up in a way that's safe for women, and that also has artifacts and culture that fosters an environment receptive to diverse publics. Secondly, that of course if there's policies to improve diversity and inclusion, that the staff and the people there are trained to implement that in practice and understand what that means. Learning pathways should ensure that novices can be onboarded at a level appropriate to their education and skills and cater to different levels of digital literacy and skill sets. And women's work should be valued and in a deliberate way, because I myself experienced subconscious patriarchal thinking that devalued women's abilities and skills to learn in a makerspace environment. And finally, learning pathways should be set up to transition women from more traditional women's work to more traditional male maker skills and digital fabrication skills, so that we can all increase our diverse skill sets. And of course, men should be learning the more traditional women's skills as well. Thank you.